Our passage is from John 6:16 through 21. I've titled this talk, Welcoming Jesus into Life's Circumstances. Little children are amazing. One of the things you notice by being around them is how presumptuous they are. They come into the world and simply expect their parents or others to care for them. It's a wonderful thing to behold. I've had the privilege to observe my wife as she cares for little children in our home. It's clear how dependent they are on her. She feeds them and plays with them. She changes them and puts them down for a nap, as well as a litany of other things too numerous to mention. This type of dependence is very similar to our first steps in a relationship with God. It begins by relying upon Him completely, like how a little child relies and depends upon those who love them. This is the foundation. This is where the journey begins with Jesus. He says it this way in Matthew 18, "Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." But children need to grow and develop. With one little girl that my wife was watching, she was as cute as a button, but every time you put her down for her nap in a pack and play, she would cry. She expected my wife to hold her until she fell asleep. While children come into the world dependent on others to care for them, it's also understood that through the normal course of events that they should grow, mature, and change in ways that are appropriate for their age, like learning how to fall asleep without being held. In our last talk, we noted the difference between having faith in Jesus, that's what the disciples had in the boat, and having the faith of Jesus, which allowed him to sleep in the storm. While the starting point of our relationship with God is having faith in Jesus, that's where it begins. We understand that as children grow, develop, and mature, the same is to be true for us in our walk with Jesus. We see this in Paul's vision for the Ephesians when he tells them that he longs for them to be built up until they all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ in Ephesians 1. In today's account from John 6:16 through 21, we're faced with another situation where we find the disciples having some trouble with the sea. And by placing this account beside our last account from Mark 4, where Jesus slept in the storm, we're going to see three things that allowed the disciples to take another step in their journey from simply having faith in Jesus to having the faith of Jesus himself. And as a result, these three things will be instructive for us in our journey. Our account begins with Jesus having already fed the 5,000. He then makes his disciples get into a boat, and as some other gospel accounts make clear, he sends them across the lake to Capernaum. He did this because he needed to dismiss the crowds who, after being fed, were ready to make him king by force. So after a strenuous day of teaching, feeding well over 5,000 people, and quelling an uprising that was intent on ushering him into power, he retreats up the mountain to be alone with his Father and pray. And so with the disciples, we find that it's evening, that they had set off for Capernaum by boat, and they began to cross the sea. We pick up in verse 17, which says, "By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them." It seems like the disciples were expecting Jesus maybe to catch a ride in another boat and meet up with them as they crossed the sea. But as darkness fell, with no signs of Jesus, they continued on to the other side. We continue on in verse 18. It says, "The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing." And in verse 19, they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. In the midst of these difficult conditions, the disciples made some progress as they battled the rough waves and strong wind. But if they had held out any hope that Jesus was going to catch up with them in another boat, that seems to be dashed in the face of these circumstances. So we come to the point where we see the first thing that helped the disciples move more deeply into having the faith of Jesus himself and its faithfulness to the tasks they've been given. What do we do when the tasks of life become wearying to us? When we're confronted with disappointments in our pursuit of seeking what is good? Maybe these disappointments are the result of following the Lord's leading, but now the road before us has become burdensome, difficult, or even impossible. In Isaiah 40:31, we're reminded of these words of encouragement. The prophet says, "But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength." You see, what we're learning in the midst of difficult situations is to develop a posture of waiting. We're learning to trust that God is at work, to trust that our strength will be renewed by Him, to persevere in these moments as we set our eyes upon the Lord who cares for us and seeks to strengthen us in the midst of this journey. So back to our account. At this point, the disciples have probably been rowing for 4, 5, or 6 hours. It's at least 3 a.m. in the morning, and all of a sudden something happens. In verse 19, it says they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. What a sight! Imagine the stress they were under as they tried to keep the boat on course while making steady progress to the other side. Then the rush of adrenaline as they caught sight of their teacher walking near them on the water. Their minds must have raced. Were they seeing things? What is it, a ghost? Or worse, a hallucination? In this flood of emotions, Jesus comforts them in their distress in verse 20 and says, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Here we see the second thing that helped the disciples step into the faith of Jesus, and that was receiving Jesus' visitation as a moment of comfort and encouragement. Back to Isaiah 40:31, that passage continues by saying how one's strength is renewed. It says, "They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." You see, as Christians, we've entered into a type of relationship with God, a real relationship in which we are both striving and receiving at the same time. And this is absolutely critical for us to understand. As we think about this, it may be helpful for us to ask how an eagle mounts up as it's flying. It simply turns its wings into the current of the wind. For us, when the Lord appears, we simply turn into the current of His love. We turn into His grace, which is simply Him acting in our lives to accomplish what we cannot accomplish on our own. And this leads us to verse 21. Then they were willing to take Him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. And so the third thing that we see that allowed the disciples to move more deeply into having the faith of Jesus was welcoming Jesus into the circumstances they were encountering. In recognizing Jesus, their fear disappeared, and they gladly took Him into the boat. Instantly, the boat was at its destination. In this account, we see these three things working together, that they had been faithful to Jesus' directions and sought to make steady progress toward their destination, even though it was difficult. At His arrival, they recognized Him and received His encouragement. And that prompted them to welcome him into the boat. And then the struggle was over. With him joining them, they made it across the sea and arrived where they were heading. For me, this passage has had a powerful impact on my life. At one point, I had experienced this deep disconnection and distance from Jesus as I sought to serve Jesus, as I sought to minister here at the Capitol. It was as if Jesus was on one side and I on the other, and what separated us was a wall in front of me that was filled with life's cares, with life's problems, with my weaknesses and my failures. It was a wall that I couldn't scale in my own strength. In reflecting on this passage we just looked at, in placing myself in this story, I was able to relate to the disciples in this account. I felt as if I was being sent in a direction that was beyond me, and I was barely holding it together. And it wasn't until Jesus arrived that I recognized him and welcomed him into the circumstances of my life that things began to change. It was as if Jesus walked around the wall of those challenges and difficulties in my life, this wall that I thought was keeping me from Jesus, and he asked me this: what if we were to do these together? I'll be with you. I'll help you. I'll lead you into the type of life that you long for. While the challenges didn't change, having Jesus with me changed everything. As we close, let me read a passage of scripture that has become one of my very favorite passages, and it's from Matthew 11:28 through 30. It says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." You see, we're learning how to enter into a type of life in which we are pulling the load of life's cares and responsibilities together with Jesus. It's a life, as I talked about earlier, in which we're both learning to strive and receive at the same time. And while Jesus won't do it for us, we don't have to do it on our own. May God bless you and encourage you with these words.